Concentration camps were one of the most brutal and bloodthirsty tools used by the Nazis during World War II. These spaces received thousands of prisoners who were subjected to the most incredible atrocities in history, places where there was no mercy and death was common. Hunger and pain were present daily to such an extent that suffering became the most loyal companion of the people confined in the different camps throughout Germany and the lands under its control. However, there was one that was special. We are talking about Ravensbrück, the only one exclusively for women, and which had the particularity of not being occupied mainly by Jews, but was the final destination of the political prisoners of the Third Reich. In this new military history video, we will learn what life was like in this ruthless Nazi camp. Stay with us to find out.
We saw some very thin women file past, dragging themselves along with shovels on their backs. It was a terrible shock because they were in such a state. It made you wonder, who on earth are these women? Where are we? You never imagined you would become the same.
These women must have done some appalling things to be treated in such a way. They looked awful to us. Some of them, who were French, called to us, "You'll soon look like us."
Contrary to popular belief, the history of Nazi concentration camps began long before World War II. The economic depression of 1929 destabilized the Weimar Republic, and while the collapse of the regime that governed Germany began, the figure of Adolf Hitler and his National Socialist Party grew. Finally, in 1933, the Führer came to power, and with him came several practices designed to have absolute control of the country. Among them, the existence of confinement spaces where tens of thousands of opponents of the ideology of the new leader were taken prisoner. Any pretext was good to stop the different groups, since, although they were mostly members of the German Communist Party, there were also criminals, asocials, and Jews. It is presumed that the first concentration camp was established in the city of Nora on March 3, 1933, in the facilities of a school. But they soon multiplied throughout the country, always under the command of the SS, the paramilitary organization at Hitler's service, which was commanded by one of the people he trusted the most, Heinrich Himmler. The legal basis for the arrests was the practice called protective custody, which meant restricting a person's freedom for their own protection or during an emergency. With this policy, the number of prisoners increased rapidly, and new camps were born to hold them. By the end of the first year in which they operated, 80% of the inmates were communists, 10% were social democrats, and the remaining 10% were affiliated with other parties, were union activists, or had no connection to a political space. However, at that time one could see a peculiarity in the large group that was captured and repressed in an attempt to bring it closer to Nazi ideology. They were all men.
Himmler was convinced that by assembling these prisoners in the regenerative forests of the Reich, the Aryan race would be purified. Up until 1937, women had been less targeted by his policy.
We're dealing with a society that imagines itself as virile, and so there's a very strong idea that women don't think, and therefore do not represent any political danger, which explains why between 33 and 37, the Nazis didn't do anything much against women.
But from 1937 on, the wind changed.
With a new approach, where the female gender had achieved greater participation in society, the concentration camps began to show a growth in the number of female prisoners, and that led to the idea of an exclusive space for them. At the beginning of 1938, Himmler began planning a camp for women considered deviant. This classification included prostitutes, abortionists, criminals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and of course, communists and Jews. For this purpose, he chose a place near the town of Ravensbrück in the picturesque Mecklenburg Lake District, an hour from Berlin, where one of his best friends from the SS had a rest home. The works for the construction of the new confinement site were carried out by male prisoners who were sent from another camp, Sachsenhausen. They worked tirelessly, in the worst conditions, and brutally subjected by the Nazi forces to finish the job as soon as possible. Many of them died of hunger and exhaustion while carrying out this task, but the SS members did not care. The most important thing for them was that by the first months of 1939, they had already set up their camp in Ravensbrück, and on May 15th of that year, the first 867 women arrived there. It is true that the violent war had not yet begun, but the apparatus set up by the Führer already had a large network prepared for what was to come.
May 1939, Germany. The Second World War had not yet broken out. Nonetheless, the Third Reich was rolling out a huge secret operation across the whole German territory. Hitler's trains and trucks crossed the country, loaded with prisoners who were political opponents or Germans and Austrians deemed unworthy of the Aryan race.
With the arrival of the battle, the number of enemies of the Nazis increased. Now it was not only limited to rivals of their ideology on German soil, but to opponents throughout Europe. In addition, Jews were one of the main targets of Hitler as a threat to his defense of the race, so they quickly became the majority within the groups of prisoners in the concentration camps. However, Ravensbrück was different. That space, which had as its first commander the SS Colonel Günther Tomaszka, had a very marked peculiarity determined by the gender of the inmates. They were all women. But in addition, the origin of the prisoners detained there also broke with the normality of the other camps. The largest group consisted of 40,000 Polish women, and another important group included 27,000 Jews from various countries, about 18,000 Russians, 8,000 French, and 1,000 Dutch. However, despite these figures, more than 80% of the prisoners in this camp were political prisoners. Continuing with the number of people who were taken to Ravensbrück, we get closer to what the living conditions were like in this camp, since Himmler had been warned from the beginning that it could hold a maximum of 50,000 inmates. However, despite knowing this figure, the place ended up grotesquely overcrowded by the more than 130,000 prisoners who ended up locked up there. Although the Nazis worked to enlarge the place and equip it with new and fearsome spaces, the occupants of the camp could not escape the overcrowding.
The brand new camp at the time comprised 16 dormitory shacks, 2 workshop blocks, the Kommandantur guard quarters, showers, kitchens, and the infirmary called the Revier. The 9 square kilometer site was ringed by a wall 4 meters high, topped with electrified barbed wire. As the roundups continued, the number of dormitory blocks doubled to 32. The Nazis also built a bunker containing 80 cells, 1 gas chamber, and a building to house 3 crematorium ovens.
Equipped in this way, Ravensbrück functioned in a similar way to most large Nazi concentration camps, and daily life there was extremely harsh. The meager food and inadequate housing reached unbearable levels with the constant influx of prisoners. In addition, this camp was also a place of work, and all inmates who were healthy enough to perform any kind of work were forced to spend 12 hours a day carrying out physically demanding tasks. Many of them even performed duties in a factory run by Siemens, to which they were taken during the day. In addition, routine selections were made to eliminate those women who were not fit for these exhausting jobs. Despite these strict characteristics, the tens of thousands of people interned at Ravensbrück managed to establish support networks over the years. They secretly took part in religious services, took part in many cultural productions, committed acts of sabotage in factories, and worked to save the lives of their sick comrades. This was largely achieved thanks to the progress of the war. In the first months of the camp's existence, when the prison population was still quite small, it became relatively easy for the SS to maintain strict control over the prisoners' daily lives. At that time, it was difficult even to meet up with other inmates during the few free hours. Occasionally, some women managed to escape despite the great risk to which they were exposed, and recited poetry, discussed politics, or sang in small groups somewhere far from the blocks of rooms. However, once the war began, even though daily life worsened in terms of food and living conditions, the SS also reduced the level of control. It was more difficult to keep track of the movement of all the prisoners, and this reduced the punishment for relatively minor infractions, such as not carrying out an order exactly as the soldiers intended. The high number of German-speaking women in the camp also facilitated the development of cultural activities, since the guards, who were mostly female, tended to be more lenient with them. At this time, it was almost a blessing not to be Jewish, since with the war in full swing, treatment of that particular group became harsher.
Political prisoner was much better. Mind you, many of them were killed or died just the same, but not as automatically as when you were Jewish. There was no question about not being sent to Auschwitz.
It is true that Ravensbrück had many artists and intellectuals among its population. Particularly notable were the large number of educated Polish women sent there, as well as groups of Czech students. Cultural activity among women usually began in the initial quarantine phase, when the new arrivals were not allowed to leave their precarious dormitories for several weeks. Many composed poems, which they memorized in their heads and recorded on scraps of paper. Others managed to put together leaflets containing songs and drawings by the inmates, and there was even music composition. However, these small glimpses of humanity that characterized this particular Nazi camp were only momentary. As in the rest of the spaces prepared for prisoners of the German forces, there was always the time for atrocities. The female exclusivity opened the possibility for different things within Ravensbrück, such as setting up the main training camp for female SS guards. From there emerged some of the most infamous and brutal figures of the Third Reich, such as Dorothea Binz. This was one of the bloodiest Nazis. She found her true calling within this camp when she began to take charge of the tortures in the punishment bunker. The sadistic German enjoyed tormenting any inmate who was caught disobeying the rules, even if it was the aforementioned meetings with other prisoners to talk about politics. No matter what the offense was, training had taught this guard to be relentless. She now knew how to inflict pain on her victims and often beat them to death. On one occasion, she saw an exhausted prisoner fall to the ground. She approached, slapped her, and then took an axe to dismember her. After killing her, she noticed that her boot had been stained with blood, so she bent down to cut a piece of the deceased's dress and clean them. This was one type of violence that women experienced in Ravensbrück, but it was not the only one. Male guards were also lethal, and often added rape to this, forcing inmates into prostitution. As a result of sexual relations, many prisoners became pregnant and had children who were confined to the same cruel fate.
The Nazis, according to their whim, would sometimes pluck a child from one block or another, and that child would never be seen again. Every evening when she returned from work, Mama anxiously wondered, will I find my little children waiting for me?
Children were particularly vulnerable during the Holocaust. The Nazis justified their murder as part of the racial struggle. or as a preventive security measure, saying that they would be a danger to the Third Reich in the future. In this way, the Germans and their collaborators killed children for these ideological reasons, and often also in retaliation for attacks by their parents. Approximately 1.5 million children were executed during the Second World War, a number that includes Jews, Roma or Gypsies, German children with physical and mental disabilities, Poles, and those living in the occupied Soviet Union. This was one of the cruelest aspects that the prisoners of Ravensbrück could see with their own eyes, and the survivors made this clear when they recalled it.
I entered this room and was appalled to find newborns piled up on the beds where they were being kept. They looked like little old men. It was horrific.
That was one thing for which I could never forgive the Germans. The children in the camps, the things we saw.
The technique of starvation had already been tried by the Nazis. In Ravensbrück, it was applied to babies and their mothers.
Now, if slavery and torture weren't enough for you, Ravensbrück also received transports bound for the gas chambers. The train arrived packed with Jewish people who were sent to this place for extermination. They were locked in a room, and a powerful cyanide-based pesticide was thrown on them that killed them in a short time. This was not something exclusive to this concentration camp, but it added to the brutality that women suffered in its facilities, as was the case with the gruesome medical experiments. One of the most notorious involved the SS surgeon, Karl Gebhardt. In 1942, he was sent to Prague at Himmler's request, since one of the Führer's most trusted men was seriously ill. He was one of the high-ranking Nazis, Reinhard Heydrich, whose life the medical professional was supposed to save. Despite the recommendations to use a particular treatment for the convalescent commander's infections, Gebhardt ignored it and looked for another way, but his efforts were in vain. Heydrich died and Hitler became furious. The tense atmosphere that followed this experience made the SS surgeon want to demonstrate that the option he had rejected was not going to work. So he decided to use the prisoners of Ravensbrück as an example. To do this, he made cuts in the victims and placed earth or glass on them to generate large infections that would then be subjected to the effect of the drugs.
To preserve his reputation, Gebhardt set out to demonstrate the ineffectiveness of sulfonamide, a forerunner of antibiotics, on gangrene. And Ravensbrück would be the arena of his medical experiments. These were carried out in the Revier, the infirmary block, a double building covering 1,500 square meters, connected by a corridor comprising 20 rooms, including 7 wards for the hospitalization of inmates, an operating theater, an examination room, and offices.
Gebhardt was not alone in this space. He was joined by Herta Oberhäuser, a Nazi nurse who enjoyed removing and reimplanting body parts from children and women to check their degree of recovery with the use of the same treatments. Her sadism reached such a point that most of them died in the operating room, and those who survived suffered serious after effects for the rest of their lives. Another of the tests in which she participated aimed to break part of the limbs of these guinea pigs to check how the nerve muscle regeneration occurred, or if a transplant was necessary. Previously, they hit them with a hammer or a chisel, then they sewed the affected parts, and, after a reasonable time, they reopened the wounds to check the results. This is how the infirmary block became the terror of the prisoners.
They took me into the operating theater in a wheelchair. I had no idea why I was being taken there. They injected us with a liquid. We were laid down, completely drowsy. We didn't know what was going to happen to us. We were in good health.
The experimentation seemed to have no limits, and the little ones were not excluded either. Children were injected with oil to extract their vital organs and bones while they were still alive. An extremely painful process that led to death in less than 5 minutes. Those who survived the cruel technique were still killed by Oberheiser, who injected them with gasoline in the arm. Thus, whatever the age of the prisoner who passed through the hands of these two infamous characters, the result ended up being the same: a brutal and merciless death.
I was that scared to go to the doctor, because if you were going to be sent to the Riviera, that they might inject you, and that's how people died.
After learning about all these atrocities, we are left with the final destination of Ravensbrück, which was the main supplier of women to the brothels established in many major Nazi camps towards the end of the war. While it was not unusual for female prisoners to be raped by guards in these places, brothels also existed as a method of control and reward for male detainees, and especially for homosexuals, as they were forced to have relations with someone of the female sex, believing that this would cure them of what the Germans understood as a deviation. Often the victims of these practices volunteered for these positions in the hope of avoiding the harder physical labor and perhaps receiving better food rations, but most died quickly due to sexual abuse and the rampant spread of venereal diseases. With the fall of Adolf Hitler and Nazism, perhaps they thought these treatments would end, but the survivors of Ravensbrück who were liberated by Red Army forces were also victims of Soviet war crimes, as they were raped by their supposed saviors. So we are coming to the end, and we can say that this concentration camp probably did not have the same impact as others like Auschwitz, but that does not mean that it was not just as bloody for its occupants. Throughout World War II, between 5,000 and 6,000 women died in the gas chamber built in the camp. In addition, it is estimated that another 50,000 died from cold, hunger, shootings, beatings, lethal injections, and various diseases. Ravensbrück may not have been etched into the Western visual imagination either, since unlike the liberation of other camps, it was not filmed or documented with iconic photographs. In fact, it doesn't quite fit into the history of the Holocaust either, as it was mostly the destination of political prisoners. However, it has left stories of pain and suffering as indelible marks on tens of thousands of lives that suffered Nazi brutality there. Adolf Hitler's relationship with the moral problems of humanity is curious to say the least, as there was a great tension between civilization and the barbarity of Nazi methods. Germany in the Third Reich presented itself as a positive beacon of ethics and progress to the world, while near its borders, concentration camps were established where truly inhuman acts were carried out. But the Holocaust was not the only gesture of immoral brutality that National Socialism gave. It also plagued occupied Europe with brothels and whorehouses, in which Hitler fed the lowest instincts of his troops. These brothels, where feasts of animal excess were held, were spread throughout the countries conquered by the Germans, and found their epicenter in Paris. Once considered the City of Lights, from 1940 onwards, the Nazis turned it into the capital of lust. French women became the main pastime of the Wehrmacht soldiers, and the Führer made sure that they had as much entertainment as possible. However, Nazi brothels reached their most sinister version within the barracks of concentration camps, where Jewish women were sexually exploited against their will by SS soldiers. Usually run by German guards turned prostitutes, these spaces of horror took the atrocities of the Holocaust to another level, surpassing those scattered throughout the cities of Europe. Are you ready to learn the sinister hidden history of Nazi brothels?
Ce qui était interdit en Allemagne était autorisé en France. Je ne sais pas si c'est ça la liberté, mais ça m'a permis de profiter de choses que je n'avais pas chez moi. Comme les bordels, par exemple.
As this Wehrmacht veteran tells it, other young Germans belonging to Hitler's army gave themselves over to the worldly pleasures offered by the streets of Paris. In a certain way, the capital of France was always a libertine place, where artists and intellectuals from all over Europe met to venture into the deepest corners of the night. Drinks, hallucinogens, and exotic dances. The heat of the flesh flowed through the Parisian brothels like water, through the canals of Venice. From the poorest to the richest, everyone found somewhere to satisfy their sexual appetites. Even at the end of the 1930s, with a good part of the continent turning socio-culturally towards conservatism and fascism, French civil society encouraged the exploration of sexual freedom. However, while Parisians gave themselves over to intellectuality and excess, they were unaware that not far from there, Hitler was preparing an invasion. Fantasizing that the Maginot Line was impenetrable, the French entrusted their security to this fortified wall that ran along the border with Italy and Germany. But they were unaware that the system designed during the First World War had a major strategic error. On May 10, 1940, Hitler ordered an advance against France, and the Blitzkrieg, the German strategy of overwhelming the enemy, struck mercilessly. The Maginot Line, far from offering an armored refuge against the Reich's tanks, divided the Allied forces into two smaller fronts, which could not withstand the onslaught of the Wehrmacht. In just 6 weeks, the cold German boot had crushed the French defenses. On June 22nd, the Nazis entered Paris in triumph, leaving this image as the greatest symbol of their power.
Les Allemands avaient la réputation d'être des barbares, surtout en France. Et là, les barbares arrivent, mais on découvre qu'ils ne ressemblaient pas à des barbares et qu'ils ne se comportaient pas comme tels. Il s'est avéré qu'ils ne mangeaient pas de petits-enfants non plus, chose dont on n'était pas si sûr au début. Ils avaient l'aura des vainqueurs. Ils fascinaient tout le monde, sans exception, même les hommes. On peut comprendre que l'arrivée de ces soldats, avec leurs uniformes bien taillés, leurs bottes en cuir sur leurs motos, était une véritable sensation.
With their historic national pride shattered, the French, who had been synonymous with progress in the 19th century, watched helplessly as the Germans, whom they considered barbarians and had defeated in World War I, surrounded the Eiffel Tower with their tanks. The feeling on the German side, however, was very different. Many soldiers of the Wehrmacht stated that their first impression upon entering Paris was being struck by the beauty of the women. In fact, some Germans found the suggestive mannerisms of the French insulting, as described by soldier Ernst in a letter to his wife in Germany.
Tu n'en croirais pas tes yeux en voyant le maudit maquillage dont les femmes se barbouillent le visage. Si mon épouse faisait de la sorte, je ferais mes bagages et je m'en irais sur le champ. C'est incroyable. Très souvent, je dois penser à autre chose, sinon je suis pris de violentes nausées. Ses lèvres rouges vifs, ses visages peints en jaune, ses sourcils surlignés de noir et ses vernis à ongles éclatants. Derrière ce tape à l'œil se cache une grande cochonnerie.
Although many Germans shared Ernst's opinion in public, in private, they felt lustful emotions towards the ladies of Paris. The makeup, the revealing dresses, the well-groomed appearance, and the voluptuous forms inflamed the soldiers' passion. They were so different from the hard-featured women in uniform promoted by Nazi propaganda in Germany that they reminded young men of pre-war times, before National Socialist homologation. Going from Berlin to Paris was like going from a grocery store to an exhibition of lustful women. Needless to say, the soldiers' excitement had to find a channel, and at first, the French madams were willing to offer the best services to the exhausted Germans. In the first years of occupation, the brothels of Paris lived a golden age, reaching some 177 locations spread throughout the Seine region. The Nazis, when they were not on guard duty, spent their time among the bars and sex workers. Such was the demand that the Wehrmacht decided to requisition the 22 most important brothels in the city, which began to run under the indirect command of the Führer.
Los soldados recibieron una lista de los burdeles autorizados. En ellos no dudaban en filmarse retozando con prostitutas a modo de souvenir personal. En los prostíbulos podían ver películas pornográficas francesas como esta, que un soldado consiguió en 1940 y se llevó como recuerdo de la campaña de Francia.
The number of prostitutes grew from a few thousand to over 10,000, and because officers spent virtually all of their pay, the supply of sexual labor became one of the most profitable businesses for young women at the time. Brothels spread across Paris like a virus, establishing themselves in private homes, basements of bars, hotels, and even in some upper-class buildings. The Führer was okay with these practices, as he preferred his men to view foreign women as a hobby rather than in more serious ways. Hitler knew that an occupying force could not humanize the enemy without weakening itself. In fact, high-ranking officers gave soldiers strict orders not to engage in liaisons or conversations with civilian women.
Éviter tout contact avec la population civile. Il est interdit d'emmener des Françaises dans une voiture de fonction ou de les tenir par le bras.
Paris, the city without eyes, silently screamed all the dirty secrets hidden in its brothels. No one ignored that prostitution was increasing exponentially, and that invading soldiers inhabited these places as if they were their second home. But this wasn't just happening with low-ranking Nazis. Officers with high positions also had their preferred spots. Perhaps the most notable brothel among the Germans was Le Chabanais. It was located near the Louvre Museum and was considered the center of perversion in French high society. This house of luxury had existed for a century before World War II, and its fame preceded it. It had been a playground for aristocrats and bourgeois of 19th century France, and even a common visiting place for politicians or diplomats visiting the country. From the outside, no one would have suspected it was the International Temple of Vice. Its facade resembled that of an old building, similar to any petit hotel in central Paris, 7 stories tall and without balconies facing the street. However, once you crossed the threshold of Le Chabanais, you entered a bustling environment where pleasure, excess, and substances prevailed. Its main attraction was its themed rooms, furnished with peculiar armchairs designed to facilitate different types of sexual acts or practices. There were also more perverse spaces where those who enjoyed fetishism could indulge in all their depravity. What happened in the brothel stayed in the brothel. Le Chabanais became a luxury exclusively dedicated to the predators at the top of the Nazi food chain, and the aspiration of many officers during the occupation was to be promoted to access this legendary palace of pleasure. Within its walls, the most beautiful young French women unabashedly surrendered to the captains, satisfying all their needs and fulfilling their darkest desires. Meanwhile, the madams collected the loot, which was more substantial than what any Frenchman of the time could offer. In addition to cash, it was quite normal for Germans to arrive with gifts for the prostitutes, whether jewelry, clothing, or food, impossible to obtain in Parisian shops. This also had a negative aspect, as French citizens, especially fervent opponents of the German occupation, began to develop great resentment towards the sex workers. Dubbed horizontal collaborators by the resistance in a clear pejorative gesture towards their occupation, the prostitutes slowly became enemies of their compatriots, who were poisoned by humiliation and resentment. By the end of the war, after France was liberated, the people were relentless and brutal towards the prostitutes and the girls of the brothels. The Nazi invasion shattered French society in many ways, and what we will see next was one of the most unjust outcomes for women.
El gentío pedía cuentas a quienes se habían acostado con los alemanes. Su delito, colaboración horizontal. Todo un ritual acompañaba a estas decapitaciones dulces, orquestadas por resistentes de la 11ª hora. Raparon la cabeza a más de 20.000 mujeres.
A través de una especie de catarsis, hicieron recaer sobre las mujeres todos los malos comportamientos de ese periodo en un intento de liberarse ellos mismos de sus faltas, de sus cobardías, de su pasividad, haciéndole pagar por ello a quien al acostarse con el enemigo había elegido el lado malo de la historia.
The occupation model, in which Nazi officers fed their soldiers' morale with local prostitutes, was replicated throughout the countries invaded by the Reich. But in Poland, the situation was not as simple as in France. While Parisian women often opted for sex work, either because it was the only way to earn money or to survive the war, Polish women were forced into prostitution. The need to keep soldiers busy with banal pleasures to prevent them from being aware of the acts they were carrying out prompted the Wehrmacht to run its own brothels throughout the conquered territory. Polish society, which suffered firsthand from the brutality of the Nazis, even more than any other occupied nation, was not prepared to offer the vastness of vices that Hitler's soldiers demanded. At first, the Germans staged many street harassment scenarios against the women of the civilian population. They approached them, touched them without their permission, searched and groped them under any excuse, and threatened to do even worse things to them. And in fact, the situation worsened on its own. Although the officers did not support the soldiers' conduct, they turned a deaf ear to the complaints of people who denounced this type of act. Abuse became a custom among German soldiers stationed in Poland, and far from ending the problem, the Nazi leaders decided to make this type of conduct official. By the beginning of 1941, German commanders allowed sexual exploitation in the territories of Poland and the Soviet Union. But, unlike in France, in this case it would be carried out through the capture of young women between 15 and 25 years old, who were smuggled to brothels requisitioned or directly set up by the Wehrmacht. This sinister practice of human trafficking came to have its own name: the Rifle. These were raids carried out by police or military officers, in which they arrested local girls and loaded them onto trucks to take them to brothels or barracks, where they were brutally raped. At the end of the war, the atrocities carried out in these places would become known. Some women and girls who managed to escape declared that they were forced to serve an average of 32 men a day. But this service set up by the army itself was not free. Nazi officials charged their own soldiers. Those who visited the brothels of horror were allocated 15 minutes at a nominal cost of 3 Reichsmarks, the current German currency of the time. Girls who did not die during work and became pregnant or unable to work could be released. Such is the case of a terrible event that occurred in Krakow when 2 15-year-old girls returned home very pregnant after being missing for a long time. According to the young women's accounts, they had been sexually exploited until the Nazis deemed them no longer fit for work. But these brutal activities went beyond Poland's borders. In the Soviet Union, because of the Germans' hatred of Slavs, even the circumstances of the women's capture were extremely violent. A post-war report by the International Military Tribunal describes, in the city of Smolensk, the German command opened a brothel for agents in one of the hotels to which hundreds of women and girls were taken. They were dragged through the street by their arms and hair. During the occupations, the Wehrmacht managed to establish an exhaustively bureaucratic system for the management of its sexual exploitation brothels. This originated in France, but spread to other countries, despite the brutal operational differences already mentioned. During the Nuremberg trials, several accusations were brought against high-ranking Nazi officials, as there were documents showing that sex workers, both voluntary and enslaved, were subjected to medical examinations to prevent sexually transmitted diseases. Some allegations indicated that these practices were carried out to prevent soldiers from taking out their libido on civilian women, but because cases of kidnapping and human trafficking were recorded in the Soviet Union and Poland, many Germans were convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity. But as if all this were not enough, we still have to talk about the most brutal brothels created by the Nazis. If the history of prostitution in the civil societies of European countries was already quite gruesome, you can't imagine what happened inside the concentration camps established by the Third Reich. That's right. The large prisons and extermination centers with which Hitler articulated the Holocaust were not only bastions of slavery, forced labor, induced starvation, and mass murder. They also created brothels of horror, spaces inhabited by sexual exploitation, abuse, and inhumanity. If outside the walls the situation was bad, inside it was even worse. The first brothel was created in the Mauthausen-Gusen camp in 1942, and was followed by those of Auschwitz and Buchenwald in 1943, and a year later, Neuengamme, Dachau, Dora Mittelbau, Sachsenhausen, and Flossenburg were added. The practices within these barracks had similarities with those of ordinary brothels, but also great differences. The forced brothel at Mauthausen was born as a kind of experiment to try to motivate the Jewish population that worked during their imprisonment. The idea of exploiting women so that the other prisoners would increase their productivity seemed logical, but this never happened. The truth is that most of the prisoners were completely physically exhausted to carry out the sexual act. In a matter of weeks, the barracks of perversion became a place of entertainment for the German criminals, the kapos, and the guards themselves. In fact, its official name was established, Lagerbordell, which simply meant brothel of the camps. But among the Nazis it was called Freudenabteilungen, which meant the division of joy, alluding to how much they enjoyed visiting those corners of the enormous prison. These places were usually located in barracks a little away from the central areas and had their own perimeter walls with barbed wire. In the smallest camps, they could house 20 private rooms for prisoners who were forced to sexually service visitors. In larger facilities, these numbers grew exponentially. The exploited Jews had to be replaced continuously, as they arrived at the brothels in a deplorable state of health, and were usually taken away in even worse conditions, sick and on the verge of death from exhaustion. These sinister buildings were guarded by female guards, who sometimes ran them or served the officers who took the profits. Some Nazis took advantage of these places of horror to carry out their own experiments, as was Heinrich Himmler himself, who decided to carry out corrective rapes in Auschwitz. During the Holocaust, Jews identified as homosexual, transgender, or any other identity were marked with a pink triangle on their sleeves. The head of the SS ordered lesbians and homosexuals to be systematically raped by members of the opposite sex, attempting to correct what he considered a deviation from human nature. In Himmler's own words, he only wanted to cure homosexuality through the therapy of knowing the joy of the opposite sex. Of course, this was just another act of cruelty based on the profound ignorance and recalcitrant hatred that the Nazis held against anyone who was different from them. For that matter, the women had been raped only for pleasure, without any kind of experimentation involved, and most of the inmates used for this purpose died in the brothels, before their fellow inmates were taken to the gas chambers. In total, it is estimated that some 32,000 women were forced into sexual work for Hitler's forces, and that the Führer himself accepted and encouraged these practices. Among all the horrors of war, there are some that are preferred not to be told, but we must remember them so as not to repeat them again. Sex and death are two impulses directly linked to war. Although they seem like completely separate things, territorial conquests end up being symbolic conquests as well, unfortunately, in many cases involving sexual violence against women. For Nazism, this was a planned state policy carried out throughout Europe, resulting in the violation of more than 34,000 women. Militarized brothels with slaves from numerous countries, spy prostitutes in Berlin, and exclusive brothels for prisoners in concentration camps are just some of the methods employed by the Third Reich to control the sexual lives of its soldiers and prisoners. In this new military history video, we want to tell you in detail how these macabre establishments worked and what was the importance of prostitution in Adolf Hitler's conquest policy. Let's begin. As Nazism advanced across Europe, acquiring new territories almost daily, high-ranking officers understood the need to establish not only military bases, but also brothels managed by the Reich. These were establishments where Sherman soldiers could have forced sexual relations with enslaved women. This morbid state policy had two clear purposes. On the one hand, it promoted the sexuality that Nazism considered normal, preventing soldiers from engaging in excessive masturbation or homosexuality. On the other hand, it aimed to control the women with whom the soldiers fraternized, preventing sexually transmitted diseases that could dangerously reduce the number of men available for combat. Of course, soldiers had no problem obeying orders. Typically, military brothels operated in old mansions, buildings, or even in brothels taken over by SS officers. The structure was used to transport women from the region, or even girls from distant countries who were installed as prisoners in those places. One incredible example occurred in the French city of Brest, where SS officers set up a brothel in a synagogue, a humiliation for both French women and Judaism. Under the Star of David, the schedules when Hitler's soldiers could avail themselves of the services of the place were displayed. It's important to clarify that when we talk about services, we actually mean systematic rapes by Sherman troops. The girls living in these military brothels did not do so voluntarily. The vast majority were victims of mass abductions or kidnappings in small villages. Officers would arrive, choose the most attractive girls, primarily those who met Aryan beauty standards, and take them as prisoners. In the everyday life of a young Nazi, sex with Slavic women was strictly forbidden, as they were considered an inferior caste. However, within the brothels, such relationships were allowed. The only exception for the SS was Jewish and Romani women, who were excluded and taken to concentration camps. Later, we will tell you the horrifying role many played there. These war crimes were not a secret. During the conflict, several invaded European states issued official complaints about the mass abductions of women. The Polish government in exile did the same on May 3, 1941. Stating that the SS conducted raids to take young Polish women to their dark, militarized brothels. The incredible part is that, on paper, Nazism considered prostitution a social disease that degenerated the minds of the youth. But apparently, that moral rule did not apply in times of war. Even the officers of the Third Reich did not abstain from this practice. life in Nazi brothels was a true hell on earth, with subhuman health conditions. In the old destroyed buildings, several girls lived, sleeping and receiving their velattors in the same bed. There were no changes of clothes or nutritious meals, only the basic conditions to make the slave as attractive enough for Sherman troops. A common problem was sexually transmitted diseases, including syphilis and gonorrhea. If a girl was diagnosed with these conditions, she was treated in a very rudimentary and disinterested manner. There would always be a prisoner to replace her. If the young woman did not improve soon, her fate was the firing squad and an unmarked grave. As we mentioned earlier, the military management of brothels also sought to appease the epidemics of these diseases, which could incapacitate a soldier for a long time. It was precisely for this reason that British spy Virginia Hall organized a series of clandestine brothels where women intentionally infected soldiers. But that's a topic for another video. As you can see, sex and prostitution are fundamental aspects of war. For the Sherman soldiers who occupied France, the summer of 1940 felt like a long vacation in which they had the opportunity to occupy the enemy's most prized city, but also to flirt and harass French women, as these amateur Nazi photographers did. France was one of the main epicenters of European prostitution. Many authors ironically describe the period between 1940 and 1945 as a golden age for the profession in the country. Prostitutes expanded their businesses like never before, and more than 10,000 women had to become prostitutes to survive the horrors of war. The vast majority of their clients were the very Nazis who had humiliated their army and people. However, as paid sex increased, so did the hatred and resentment of the rest of the French towards those who offered their services to the enemy. The tragic part is that for many women who were victims of Sherman brothels in Europe, the hell did not end in 1945 with the unconditional defeat of the Third Reich. Once the conflict was over, prostitutes were persecuted as traitors to the homeland and collaborators with the Nazi regime. In France, prostitutes were lynched, publicly stripped, shaved, and had a swastika painted on their faces as seen in this shocking video. Like Cain's mark, they were forced to march with the sign that they had slept with SS officers. Others were shaved, and they went down in history as femmes tendues, or shaved women. In these cases, they were victims of violence during and after World War II. While concentration camps were a world apart from reality, with their own rules and horrors, the fact is that several institutions from the outside world operated within those facilities, and brothels were no exception. You might think that these spaces were reserved only for guards and officers overseeing the camps, but there were also women designated for the most important prisoners, those who collaborated with Nazism or organized the workforce of their fellow inmates. The women who worked in these facilities did not do so voluntarily, but were forced and threatened. One of the first concentration camp brothels, or Lager Bordel, was established in the Mauthausen camp in 1942 to boost prisoners' productivity. In June 1943, one was set up in Auschwitz, and the following month, another in Buchenwald. This policy took inspiration from Soviet gulags, where the amount of work determined a prisoner's food ration. Those who worked properly and collaborated with SS officers had permission to visit these places. This service was mainly used by kapos, prisoners of certain status within the camp, with a somewhat less harsh life and more access to resources such as food and hygiene. The rest of the prisoners did not have the necessary energy to attend these establishments. Sexual encounters in these brothels were entirely supervised and planned. According to researchers, only the missionary position was allowed, and the act was limited to a maximum of 15 minutes, not a minute more. The horror generally occurred at night between 8 and 10 p.m., although on Sundays the shift was much longer, making it the most grueling and painful day for the prisoners. They had to endure eternal hours, receiving violator after violator in their quarters. The existence of Lager Bordel gave rise to a new form of trade within concentration camps: the exchange of coupons that could be exchanged for sexual encounters. The business was monopolized by common criminals, those who, before being imprisoned, were already breaking the law. A system of green triangles was used, which could be exchanged for 15 minutes of sex. There is also evidence that, in some cases, imprisoned women had a tattoo on their breasts with the inscription Feldhuur, or camp whore, a humiliating way to identify and separate them from the rest of the prison population. As we already mentioned, women in intracamp brothels were forced to perform this work and came from various concentration camps distributed across Europe. For example, one of the most frequent was the entirely female Ravensbrück camp, where the most attractive young women were selected, preferably without Jewish ancestry. The SS officers devised a perverse method that aligned the prostitutes, providing them with minimal benefits, such as slightly higher rations or the possibility of personal hygiene. This generated envy and resentment among the rest of the female population in the camps, thus breaking any possibility of collaboration between the imprisoned women. Nina Mikhailovna, a concentration camp prisoner, later admitted, "When we found out that one of the girls from our block had been chosen, we captured her, threw a blanket over her and beat her until she couldn't move. We didn't know if she would recover. They just sought better treatment, and we punished them in this way." It is estimated that in total about 200 women worked in these brothels with the promise of being released after 6 months, something that never happened. As if the mass rape of women was not enough crime, the Third Reich also embarked on a morbid campaign of sexual re-education within concentration camps. In addition to using brothels to control inmates, encourage collaboration, and prevent disturbances, Heinrich Himmler also tried to use them as a means to show prisoners of the pink triangle, i.e. homosexuals, the pleasures of the opposite sex. It was a conversion therapy, a kind of cure for homosexuality, something that the Third Reich considered a moral degeneration, typical of modernity. Historians claim that Himmler ordered that all gay prisoners make compulsory visits once a week to the camp brothels as a means to cure them of their same-sex attraction. Once the war ended, the few women who survived that torment had to endure the stigma of being camp prostitutes, despite actually being victims of the violence of the Nazi system. The vast majority of the girls who worked in intracamp brothels were of Sherman origin, but had been categorized by the Nazis as asocial. When the conflict ended, they were never recognized as victims or compensated appropriately. The Nazis defined as asocial people without homes, alcoholics, wandering musicians, prostitutes, or any women who did not fit into the ultra-conservative vision of the Nazis. They were generally people from very poor backgrounds. Prostitution within concentration camps was a dark secret, at least until the early 1970s when several memoirs were published, delving into this aspect with some depth. However, the topic remained taboo in research on Nazism until the mid-1990s, when new publications by female researchers broke the silence. One of the strangest and unique cases of using prostitution as a war policy was Salon Kitty. It was a select Berlin brothel operated by Nazism, where, in addition to offering sex and pleasures, espionage campaigns were conducted against important figures. The place operated at number 11 Giesebrechtstrasse, where a building with commercial premises houses a headphone store and an interior decoration store today. However, between 1930 and 1942, the largest brothel of the Third Reich operated there. The important name in this operation was Katja Emma Sophie Schmidt, alias Kitty Schmidt, a woman who operated as the leader of the 500 square meters on the third floor of the building. Prostitutes from all over Europe, mainly from countries like Poland or Czechoslovakia, worked there. Kitty was a music teacher in her 40s who had lived in various parts of the world and had learned the secrets of the night, finding in brothels a secure and perpetually in-demand business. On paper, the Nazis were against these types of establishments that proliferated throughout Berlin during the 1920s. Keep in mind that, before Nazism, it is estimated that 125,000 women and 35,000 men were engaged in sexual services. The difference is that Salon Kitty was intended to be a meeting place for foreign diplomats settled in Berlin or passing through the capital, although the place was also frequented by military personnel and potential internal enemies of Adolf Hitler's regime. The brothel rooms were the ideal place to learn the secrets of the city's most important men. In the intimate lobby of the salon, where a grand piano rested, crystal chandeliers, and thick carpets, it was expected that confidences would be made that could be used by Nazi leaders to punish dissidents or anticipate decisions of friendly countries. For this, a listening device with microphones was installed. What was said in the rooms on the third floor reached the basement, where a network of cables transported the sound to record it on large discs. The masterminds behind the plan were two high-ranking young men from the Nazi regime. On the one hand, Reinhard Heydrich, the ultimate head of security and later co-architect of the Holocaust, who had the idea. And, on the other hand, one of the main exponents of Sherman espionage, Walter Schellenberg, who put it into practice. Or at least, this was the official version for decades since. Over time, disputes have arisen over how Salon Kitty really worked. The truth is that there are many mysteries behind the operation of this establishment, from the true espionage method to how often important personalities attended. One of the most repeated stories is that of Galeazzo Ciano, son-in-law of Benito Mussolini, who attended a cinema near the brothel. Once the lights went down and the movie began, the Italian secretly left to avail himself of Schmidt's girls' services. Ciano returned minutes before the movie ended, just in time to applaud and praise the performances and plot twists. Historians are also not sure about the role of Madame Miss Kitty. Was she a collaborator sympathizing with Nazism, or was she forced to collaborate from her area of expertise? Much of what is supposedly known tends to be confused with another movie, Salon Kitty, an exploitation film by Italian director Tinto Brass. In that film, the events are exaggerated and have much of perverse fantasy. Such was the impact of Nazi spy prostitutes that during the 1970s, a series of films contextualized in Reich brothels and bordellos were filmed. Of course, like in Tinto Brass's film, the percentage of truth was widely diluted in exaggerated and morbid fictions. The paradox is that the stories told by real survivors of prostitution during this time recount much more gruesome and savage events than those in any horror movie.
La prostitución, tanto forzada como voluntaria, fue uno de los fenómenos más importantes durante la Segunda Guerra Mundial. En el caso del Tercer Reich, esta práctica fue militarizada y empleada como arma de combate, tanto para control interno como para llevar a cabo ambiciosas operaciones de espionaje. El uso como herramienta de algo que la ideología nazi consideraba como amoral y degenerado es solo una muestra más de la inconsistencia narrativa dentro de las creencias del nacionalsocialismo. De esta manera llegamos al final de este video. Recuerda que estas son solo algunas de las miles de historias que nos dejó la contienda más violenta del siglo XX. Si quieres seguir conociéndolas, te invitamos a seguirnos y activar las notificaciones. Por el momento nos despedimos hasta la próxima entrega de Historia Militar.